Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this workshop. We're delighted to have you here with us today, especially because we're going to be talking about one of our favorite subjects, which is the subject of international students. And I hope that it's going to be one of your favorite subjects too. For the first part, here are the 5 tips that I'll be covering. Number 1, plan for differences in classroom culture. Number 2, mind the gap. Number 3, assist in classroom integration. Number 4, foster peer integration. And number 5, foster student-faculty relationships. After that, we will have a discussion time, and then we'll move on to Ray's part of the presentation. His tips will be: know your expectations, avoid ambiguity, address academic integrity, grade based on competency, not on language, and know where to go to help. So let's talk about our international students here at Carolina. Who's sitting in your classroom? This is a nice graphic created by the International Student Services Department with last year's fall statistics. They have not yet computed this year's fall statistics, and we do hope that this year is an anomaly, obviously. But as you can see, we had nearly 2,000 international students last year from 98 different countries. And these are the majors they particularly were interested in: computer science, mechanical engineering, hospitality management, chemistry, and chemical engineering. This is a really nice graphic because it's easy to see the implications. We have a large portion of our students from China. We have another large portion from Asia, a significant part from the Middle East, and a significant part from Europe, as well as some others as well. So who are our international students? Our international students in general are bright, they are motivated, and they are eager to learn. But they have a handicap. They are handicapped by language, and they are handicapped by cultural differences. So how can we help them to be winners here in our educational system at this university? The first 5 tips that I'm going to share with you are based on perceived problems that are often reported in United States classrooms as far as participation goes with international students. The first is participation itself. The second is communication within the classroom, both what they hear and what they say. The third is classroom integration, becoming a part of the classroom. The fourth is integration with American students, and the 5th is integration with faculty. So tip number 1 is we need to plan for differences in the classroom culture. I'm going to first show you 3 statements. These statements were generated by 2 professors, McGregor and Folazano, in use for a study at Niagara College in Canada. This was compiled for the TESOL Journal 2018. I'm going to show you these 3 statements. I would be interested in seeing you use your little icons to raise your hands as to whether you agree or not, and then I'll tell you what their results were in their study. These are 3 statements about participation of international students. Statement number 1, please raise your little icon hand if you agree. International students do not participate significantly in class. So how many of you would agree with that? Nobody. All right, that's wonderful. Okay, statement number 2. International students participate less than domestic students. Would anybody agree with that? Okay, I've got a few people that agree with that. It's adding up a little bit. Here's the last statement. International students participate as much as domestic students. So please raise your hand if you agree with that 3rd statement. Okay, let's go back. For the first statement, international students don't participate significantly in class. Professors surveyed in this study in 2018 in Niagara College, 50% agreed, and they felt this was true. The second statement, international students participate less than domestic students. 70% of the professors surveyed agreed. However, what's interesting is the third statement, international students participate as much as domestic students. When domestic students responded to that question, 55% of them said, we agree. And international students agreed at the rate of 58%. So let's look at the students that are at Niagara College, very similar to the student body here. They have about 25% Chinese, 14% Korean, about 50% from the Indian subcontinent, and then there are a few others. This is just one table that we're going to look at. This is perception of performance, and of course, this is what relates strongly to the idea of classroom participation. So, which tasks do international students perform well? And international students responded to this question, and domestic students responded to this question. On the issue of group work, international students themselves said 70% of the time international students perform this task well. However, domestic students, only 45% felt that they performed well in this task. So that's very revealing, and that's very important for us to bear in mind. I think the other point here that's pertinent for our discussion, oral presentations. 41% of international students feel that in general international students do this well, but only 8% of domestic students. So these are two big areas for us to bear in mind as we talk about classroom communication. So tip number one is to plan for the cultural differences. And I'd like to highlight a few cultural differences that I've read about that you might find interesting. One young lady who is a student from China at Indiana University wrote that in China, students may not speak unless they raise their hands and then only to ask a question. And unless the instructor picks them, they can never speak. And it is not necessarily the case that they do participate in class. The purpose, the explicit purpose of their instruction in China is to sit in the classroom, copy what the instructor says, memorize what the instructor says, give it back on the test. So a Chinese student, according to this Chinese student, might sit completely silent through a whole term because they have been trained not to speak their minds, not to raise conversation, and never to disagree with the instructor. So you can see that already culture has taught them the opposite of what we'd like to encourage here. Comments from another article that was actually written about how the Chinese and Asian systems in general related to employment and business, saying the grading system brainwashes students into believing that working in groups is not beneficial. So again, one of the ways we want them to participate is to work in groups. But they have been taught that's not good. They're also taught that grades are limited in the sense that all grades have to be given by the bell curve, and there's only a certain number of A's and a certain number of B's, so they're always in competition with each other. And again, the teaching style is you should just listen quietly. To show respect is not to speak to your teacher, and of course, even in some cultures, to show respect is not to look at your teacher because it's rude to make eye contact. So what can we do to counter this cultural input for students who come to our country from other countries? Here are some various ideas collected from our experience and also from online. One is the idea of reflection. If any of you have been involved in University 101, you're familiar with the activity called Think, Pair, Share, where a discussion question is presented, students are given time to reflect, and then they talk in pairs. And then after that, they move on to talk in the big group. When international students have some time to reflect and to talk quietly together, they then feel more prepared to handle the language issues of speaking to a large group. Small groups work very well for encouraging classroom participation. They can get to know small groups, often feel more comfortable speaking to a group of 4, 5, or 6, as opposed to a group of 25, 30, 100, or 200. Since cultural expectations of education styles differ so much, it's very important that we are explicit about what we would like for classroom participation and why we would like it, why we would feel that it's important. So again, students from many other countries that are here feel it's rude or inappropriate to draw attention to themselves by speaking in the class. So they need to understand explicitly what we want. Another thing that can help is preliminary topic involvement, an opportunity to do some reading or to watch a video before they actually participate in the classroom. A flipped classroom setup can be very advantageous for students as they watch a lecture first at their own pace, maybe twice, to feel really comfortable with the material, to feel like they've mastered it before they become involved in conversation. Tip number 2, mind the gap. What gap do we mean? We mean the communication gap. These are some things that can often cause a gap in communication. Idioms and slang are a huge issue. They are very much a part of culture, and they are things that we learn culturally, but they don't make any sense with a dictionary. So if I say, hey, we need to make a decision now, don't kick the can down the road, they're lost. If I say, oh, don't worry about it, I was just pulling your leg, what does that mean? Or if a professor says, all right, we've had enough general discussion, let's cut to the chase, the student is going to be lost again. So idioms and slang can be a real problem. Pace can be an issue. We just need to be aware of pace. I like to be aware of taking time to pause. It's sometimes hard to slow down your speech or even to know how to slow down speech, but it's not so hard to take extra pauses, to just allow a moment for students to think and maybe not to talk so quickly. Our students really benefit from visual support. One of the things that I've found with my students is that they may be able to read material, but there's almost no connection between what they read and what it sounds like or how it's pronounced. So if they've done preparatory reading before a lecture, they may not necessarily recognize those words when we say them in class. So visual support of key ideas and key terminology is very, very useful. Another thing that we need to bear in mind that causes a communication gap is a lack of shared cultural background. So I read about one philosophy professor who used to use a lot of Seinfeld material in his class to teach his topic material. But he came to find that the international students weren't familiar with it, couldn't relate to it because it was so culturally closely tied. Think of fairy tales. We all are familiar with fairy tales like the story of Cinderella. Someone can quickly reference the idea of Cinderella, and those of us who grew up in this culture have a whole set of associated ideas, and a lot has been communicated in that one reference. But our students don't have that cultural literacy. They don't share that background. So it's not that we need to eliminate those things. We just need to be sensitive to it and aware of how that can impact communication. We can be aware of how we use humor and jokes. And again, it's not that we want to eliminate them. Our students certainly need to become more familiar with these things, but we might want to limit them. We might want to be more careful. We might want to take time to explain them. It depends on your situation. But linguistically, humor and jokes are some of the last things that students ever come to understand. Sarcasm, too, is very difficult. I think sarcasm is tied very much to tone of voice And if you come from a culture and a language that doesn't use tone of voice, then it's very hard to pick up a sarcastic tone of voice. And again, facial expressions, but if you're not used to closely tracking facial expressions, you won't get that either. One of my biggest mistakes that I have to constantly correct myself on is this last point: avoid yes/no check-in questions. I like to check in with my students, I'm sure you do too, and it's automatic for me to say, does that make sense? Do you understand? And of course, being polite students, they're going to say, oh yes, that's fine. No, we don't have any questions. Unfortunately, that doesn't always elicit the truth. It just elicits a polite response. One of my colleagues, Mark, is really good at this. He's really good at, after he presents something, saying, can anybody explain to me, Ping, can you explain to me what the 5 things are that I want you to do right now? So that's a much better question. Tip number 3, assist classroom integration. This again doesn't come naturally to our students, but it's so important. Here are some ways that we can assist classroom integration. First, do fair and clearly assigned group work. I find that my students participate a lot better if they have an exact role that they're supposed to fulfill. So when I was teaching at EPI, for example, I might tell one student, you are the leader, you make sure everybody talks, you make sure you do what you're supposed to do. Another student, you are the recorder, you take notes on the decisions your group makes. Another, you're the researcher, you're going to get online and you're going to find the answers to the questions. And I find that when they have a role, they do a lot better. Assignments in writing are very, very important. They make a big difference. Exemplars of excellent work and poor work make a really big difference. And finally, diverse discussion groups can be really, really helpful, especially I think if these can last more than just for one period. If they can perhaps be assigned for a couple weeks or even the whole term. So if left to themselves, if you tell our students to divide up into groups, they will automatically clump together by language groups. It happens every time. But if you can assign them and diversify them and mix up those groups linguistically, it really, really helps. And then they can start to feel more comfortable with talking to people that aren't from their country. Another thing that I've found really enjoyable is to use non-American names in the materials, in tests, in examples on PowerPoints. That really helps. Student names, use student names in the classroom yourself. My daughter was here a number of years ago, and she took a history class with Walter Edgar. And as you can imagine, it was a very large class. What amazed her was that in spite of the fact that it was a very large group, he learned every student's name. And not only that, but he often recognized names and said, oh, is your father blah, blah, blah? And he remembered those names from way back then. And you can imagine the kind of warmth that generated in that classroom. And finally, explicitly stated expectations. What do you want from assignments? What do you want from activities? Tip number 4 is to foster peer integration. We want our students to relate well to their peers. We want them to integrate and become a part of the university, not just be a separate little cluster off on their own. So these are some great pictures. These were created by a Chinese graphic artist who lived for a while in Germany as a student. So the blue on my left, I guess on the left-hand side of the paper, the blue represents German and thereby Western culture, and on the right, Chinese. So we're going to look at a few of these, and let's talk about some of the differences between the Western and the Eastern cultures. So this first one is about interpersonal connections. So if you take a moment, you will notice that the blue, people tend to have interpersonal connections with just a few people. But the Asian, the idea is that people are broadly connected one way or another to everyone else. Lifestyle is really different. I mean, the West are so individualistic, but in the East, you have very much this idea of group lifestyle, that everybody's interconnected. And even at a party, that's obvious, as sometimes in the West, you will have little clumps of people, maybe some people not even part of a clump, but in the East, the idea is that everybody should relate. So what are some ways we can help our students relate more to their peers when they're moving into this culture that doesn't necessarily make that easy? One way is through the Buddies Beyond Borders system here at USC, part of International Student Services. It's a great program whereby students can get a buddy, get a partner, and get to know somebody from another culture. Another great program in International Student Services is the events that are provided. Of course, that's a little bit strange right now. Not everything happens, but they can attend, looks like international film screenings, do hiking trips, and it says participate in the largest international event on campus, which would be the International Festival, which happens in the fall. And that's a really exciting time for our students. There are a large number of international student organizations, so a lot of those focus on one particular culture, but hopefully students can use those to meet a broader range of students, get more comfortable at the university, and hopefully reach out. I think another really beneficial thing to do is to let our American students know, hey, these are the businesses of the future. These people that are in the classroom with our American students are the people that are going to be representing businesses, and it's a huge help to our students now, our American students, to get an opportunity to relate to Chinese people, to Korean people, to Saudi people, to understand how to build relationships and feel comfortable. And whatever opportunities we can offer our students, those are really, really useful as well. Small group activities, small group assignments outside of class can be really helpful. Tip number 5 is to foster good relationships with student and faculty with us. One way to do it is to have lunches, and of course we have some great programs here at Carolina that allow for that sort of thing. Another way of building relationships with our students is to keep maps on our office walls. And I read this some time ago. I thought it was a great idea. One particular professor spoke of having a world map up on his wall, and whenever any international student came in, asking them to show where they were from and tell a little bit about it, tell a little bit about themselves. I have done that on my computer monitor when students have come in to talk with me, and their eyes really light up when you ask them to do this. You can also have worldviews discussions, and maximizing your office hours is helpful. It amazes me that term after term after term, even though I explain the concept of office hours, my students don't come unless I make it an assignment. But if they've come once because it's an assignment, I find they're much more likely to come back again and visit either in the virtual setting or the physical setting. Frequent individual conferences are great. Email summaries. They can send you a summary about their lives, or you can have them send summaries about their opinion about classroom discussions. And also, I think at the beginning of classes, introduce yourself discussion boards are a really great way to build relationships between us and our students, and also among peers.
All right, thank you, Anne. Yeah, and Dr. Morgan suggests a pre-survey question. That's not a bad idea either. If I know many teachers will conduct some type of survey prior to their class to get to know their students, or do it maybe in the first week. And yeah, that would be I think a pretty simple question to add to that. That's a good suggestion. Thank you, Dr. Morgan. So the 6th tip is to know your expectations. Okay, Anne already talked about a little bit about cultural differences and maybe understanding how those cultural differences translate into what you're seeing and hearing in the classroom. So I have a couple of proverbs that I've come up that I've posted here on the slide that I think maybe provide a little bit of insight into the mindset behind different cultures. So if you look at the screen right now, we here in the U.S. have the expression "the squeaky wheel gets the grease." So the idea is if you want something, if you need something, you need to speak up. It's on you as the individual to make yourself known and to let know if you have any questions or issues. Comparing that to a Japanese proverb, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. Well, that seems to me to be working in the opposite direction. So the idea is standing out by asking a question or by presenting an issue that your peers are not also presenting is not seen as a positive thing so much. Another couple of proverbs here that I kind of like that I think may provide some insight, and these are, of course, generalizations, so they don't apply to all individuals, but we have the U.S. proverb of the early bird gets the worm, right? So the idea is to be more successful, you should be the first to do something, or you should get out ahead of the others, so to speak. If we compare that to a Chinese proverb, it says the leading bird is the first to get shot. Well, again, to me, that says something quite contrary to what the U.S. proverb that we have on the screen there is. So just a couple of proverbs here that I think may provide a little general insight into what you may see in terms of mentality from students. Going back to the pictures that were made by the graphic artist student who was from China but studied in Germany a little bit. So we can see here, basically, this would be the idea of standing in line, right? So here in the West, we have a pretty kind of ingrained into us that if you are going somewhere and you are not the only person going to the cash register or whatever the case may be, you form a nice line, right? And so that's what's expected here in the U.S. However, if you compare that to the picture on the right, you'll see that is not what's expected in what this artist has considered her view of the Chinese culture. So there, I think, to me, that kind of shows that what we expect in different cultures is not the same. This one here, now this one talks about the topic of truth. And if you can see on the left, you can see the person is thinking apples, speaking apples. The person on the right is thinking pears, speaking apples. Now, when I first saw this, I thought, well, I don't think that I've had a lot of experience with Chinese students. I don't think that my Chinese students are lying to me. In fact, they are bluntly honest sometimes. But what I understand from this picture is more in the West, we are kind of told, say what's on your mind. Say what's on your mind. Versus, well, you may have something on your mind, but should you say it, or is there something more important, like perhaps the social cohesiveness of a particular group? If that is more important than saying that exactly what's on your mind, then maybe you would be felt compelled to say something that's different that's on your mind. So anyway, this is my interpretation of these pictures, but again, I think it kind of illustrates differences in cultures and what's expected of individuals within the culture. Problem solving, you can see on the left, the ideas in the West, we take a problem straight on, tackle it, take it head on. Other expressions that we have that I think exemplify that. And on the right, you can see, well, if there's a problem, maybe the best route is not to address it directly, but indirectly, or to find a way around the problem as opposed to just solving the problem completely. in terms of how people are viewed. So here, the title here is the position of the boss. I think how does that relate to the classroom? Well, and this might not be that much different from some domestic students, but as a teacher, you're kind of seen as the boss of the class by some cultures. And what does that mean? Well, in our culture, the teacher may be seen as a near peer. You know, we're on the same level basically, so we can talk openly about what we think and what we feel and things like that. Whereas in other cultures, possibly in an Eastern culture, you seen as the boss, you have a much larger presence. And going back to something Anne mentioned before, this may illustrate why some students in Eastern culture or other cultures may be hesitant to speak directly or openly to a person in a position of authority. It just may be disrespectful, and so they're very much not inclined to do so. Okay, next one. Sorry again for the lack of a visual here, but the next one is to try to avoid ambiguity. And well, how can you do that? Well, I think it's about being explicit. So we may assume that domestic students, for example, would do things or react to things in a certain way without explicitly saying that. So we can just assume that if we mention something that our students, our domestic students, will catch on and will have no trouble understanding. However, that might not always be the case with international students. So we found it practical to be explicit, not only in your syllabi, which I think most syllabi are pretty explicit and detailed, but also to reinforce that whenever you're starting your class, right? As we all know, not everybody reads their syllabi all the way through, unfortunately, regardless of what country they're from, what culture they're from. So making sure it's clear from the beginning what's expected in terms of classroom behavior, as in terms of coming on time to class, as well as what's expected in terms of participation. In terms of instructions, you can, as many of you probably know, listening skills when you're learning a new language, those are some of the later skills that develop. It's difficult to listen to something and try to keep up with the meaning in a language that's not your native language. However, written language is more asynchronous by nature. So a student, if they didn't catch what you said in class, would have the option of referring to writing that they could then take their time and make sure they understand. So I've become a lot more conscious of that, and I make sure that when I provide instructions that I make sure that like in our online environment now, that I have them in writing on a slide, and then that's a slide that the students can have access to by posting it to Blackboard. When you're thinking about assessing how things are going in the class, that's also something that, as Anne mentioned, that you want to be explicit about and keep in mind what the cultural gaps are. Anne mentioned earlier, well, maybe it's not a good idea to ask a yes/no question, because generally speaking, you're going to get a yes regardless of what the answer really is, because again, it's maybe more important for the student to maintain a level of respect than to say exactly what's on her or his mind. And then also eliciting certain questions, being, as opposed to open or yes/no questions, leaving the questions more open-ended. Another thing that could be different depending on what they're used to is what is the exact nature of academic integrity. So what does that mean exactly? I know most of my students that are national would say, well, that means no cheating. Well, what does that mean exactly? So I think it's helpful to be explicit when you're trying to tell them what they can do and what they cannot do. Many of them will probably already know that many things are not okay. And we'll see some statistics to kind of support that later. But you want to make sure that you don't leave out some vital details that could lead a student to being confused about what is right versus wrong in terms of completing an assignment. I think a good example there would be group work, being explicit to let a student know that on this assignment, you must do this individually versus this assignment can be done in group work. Okay, this goes back to the article in the TESOL journal that Anne referred to earlier. What you see here on your screen are the survey results from that study. And the question that was posed here was, what do you think can be done to improve the international student experience? And as you can see, international students were asked. You can see that in the first column there. Domestic students were asked, and then professors were also asked. And I've highlighted two of the results here. And the first one is they were asked about improving student-teacher dialogue. So you can imagine, would improving student-teacher dialogue improve the international student experience? You can see the international students felt pretty strongly that that was something that was important. Over a quarter of them thought that that would help their experience. Comparing that to the instructors that were asked, only 7% of them felt that that would improve the international student experience. So at least for the purposes of the results of this survey, I think we can see a pretty significant gap between what international students believe would help versus what the instructors who were asked this believe would help. If we want to look at something that's kind of in the opposite direction, if you look at towards the bottom here, you can see they were asked the question, well, would making an accommodation for the students, would that help the student experience? And you can see a pretty sizable majority of the professors thought that that would be helpful, but a very small percentage of the international students thought that that would be helpful. So that's, I think, another kind of striking difference in perceptions between international students and what they think it would improve their experience versus what instructors think. All right. The tip number 8, addressing academic integrity. I kind of mentioned this earlier in terms of being explicit when doing this. I did want to share some statistics that are specific to the University of South Carolina. This is a little old. This was a 2017-2018 report, but I would be surprised if it's changed dramatically since then. As you can see here, that our academic integrity office, 9% of the cases they handled involved international students. And if we compare that to the total international student population, 7%, I think you can see that that's not significantly higher than the overall population. So to me, that says, well, they're being reported at about the same rate as a domestic student. So I don't think any reason to believe that there's any significant differences in terms of what we learned from the Office of Academic Integrity. The next statistic shows that 33% of the international students had more than one violation. So perhaps one conclusion that could be drawn there is if there are repeat offenders, so to speak, then that probably lies more on the individual than some more general interpretation of what's going on. And then another interesting fact here is that most of the violations for international students were cheating on tests rather than plagiarism. So that was something that I found quite interesting, in part because one thing we do in our program is to try to really teach the students what plagiarism is and how to avoid it. And so that's something that struck me. Okay. A couple of years ago, a survey was conducted here also at the University of South Carolina. You can see a total of 78 students were asked. 56 were international, 22 were domestic. And you can see some of the results here. So American students generally think everyone cheats, and international students think that very few people cheat. What are the top self-admitted cheating offenses? Well, Americans would report working on homework when I suspect they were not allowed to. Whereas internationals think that using information without citing them from other sources was the top offense. Another interesting result here is that students that answered this question, and this was both for international and American students, students generally don't admit or don't believe that cheating is something that's allowed or tolerated in their country. And a very high percentage of the international students that were asked felt that they were at least somewhat familiar with the concept of academic integrity. Just some interesting survey results that reflect what our students' thoughts are on some of these issues. This is a graphic display of the answers when they were asked which of the following statements they most agree with. I know that the coloring here is maybe a little hard to discern, but if we look over at the international students pie there, you'll notice that the largest share was the statement, cheating will have a negative impact on your future. Versus 28% of American students that agreed most with that statement. The next biggest percentage there is the nobody cheats in the international students at 38%. And I know it's hard to tell, but because the colors are a little bit easy or hard to distinguish, but the American students, nobody stated that nobody cheats. So I think that's a pretty interesting difference in what the students, international versus domestic, think in terms of what other people are doing in terms of academic integrity. These are just some word clouds here taken from the comments that were made by international versus domestic students. And you can see one thing that stands out to me is grades. Grades is a word that stands out. So I think possibly you can say that that's something that both international students and domestic students would agree are important. One word that stands out to me in the word cloud for the international students is understand. So perhaps there are comments that say maybe they don't understand what academic integrity actually means, versus the word lazy over here in the domestic student comments. So maybe the thought is that academic integrity is often an issue, maybe because a student is not putting forth the effort to avoid violating the academic integrity here at USC. One thing that we found helpful in our program is asking students to write things by hand. Well, why is that important? Well, as you know, there are many things that students can use online to help them with writing assignments and things like that. Some of those may be admissible or permissible and fine, but buying an essay online, I think everybody would agree that that's not something we want our students to be doing, and that is not following along with the honor code here at USC. But by having students actually submit things in writing as you can see them writing it, I think you can be much more confident that what you're reading from the student is actually from the student. One of the last slides here is just a screenshot of the webpage for student conduct and the Office of Academic Integrity. I believe you probably all know, but just to make sure, if you do suspect any type of academic integrity a violation, then the Academic Integrity Office very much encourages you to submit that. Their philosophy generally is they want to educate students to help them to avoid doing that in the future. So they very much take an approach of, well, let's see how we can correct this so that it doesn't happen again. So by submitting violations to the Office of Academic Integrity, maybe it's not the best to see it as I'm punishing the student, but keeping in mind that the office wants to help them to prevent them from doing that in the future, reporting them may actually benefit them in the long run. Okay, tip number 9. So we're almost at the end here. Grade based on competency and not language. This is an older graphic here that maybe some of you have seen before, but basically what this illustrates is the writing, the written discourse logic that you might find in different cultures. The thing that I always draw from this is that in English we tend to go from point A to point B with the idea of let's get to the point, let's talk about what we're doing. But if you compare that to writing written discourse in other cultures, you can see, at least based on the work here done by Kaplan, that the logic of the writing style doesn't always follow what we as English writers would consider a linear pattern. But that doesn't necessarily make it wrong, it just makes it different. And I know from my own experience, for me, if I read an essay, for example, that follows a very linear pattern in what I'm expecting, it's much easier for me to understand what's going on and to follow the student's ideas. But if I find a logic or logical pattern in the writing that doesn't fit in with what I kind of expect, then I find it more difficult for me to follow the ideas. And I think I generally build up a sense of, well, this essay might not be as good as what I'm expecting. But is it really, or is it just it's not meeting my expectations of a logical flow of the ideas? A few tips on grading, and I don't think that these are that much different from what you might consider doing for a domestic student, but these things might be more pronounced in international students given their hurdles. Making sure that students know in advance how things will be graded so that they can make sure that they know what expectations they need to meet. And being more specific rather than less specific, I've found to be more effective. When you're grading something, it's, I think, always good to think, okay, well, what is the objective here? Is the objective for me to understand if they've understood the content material, or am I grading based on grammar or vocabulary issues? And depending on how you've laid out the objectives, it could be one or both or the other. So just making sure that, and I know I do this, I'll go back to the objective that I'm looking at, and just make sure I stay focused on what the grade should be based on, and not so much grading based on little things that might irritate me, but might not necessarily be in line with what the objective is setting out to do. Another tip that I would recommend is there's no real need to lower standards based on somebody not being or being an international student. In fact, I don't think that would help them, or I don't think that they would appreciate that. And if we think about the survey results from before, although a significant percentage of the instructors asked thought that international students getting accommodations could be helpful to their experience, we noticed that the international students themselves did not feel that way. They did not feel that those would be helpful for them. So just something to kind of think about. All right. Speaking of accommodations, again, this comes from the McGregor and study. One thing I just want to point out here is that the question that was posed here is which of these things do you feel would be helpful in helping you to be successful in the classroom? And one thing that that stands out to me is right at the top here. So international students feel that being able to use a dictionary in class is helpful. And instructors also felt that way, as well as domestic students. They felt that way. So one thing that you might want to think about here is if you do have a significant percentage of international students in your classroom, is maybe to explicitly let them know, while we're doing this, if you need to use a dictionary to help you follow along, please do. And that does seem like an accommodation that both international students would appreciate, and that instructors feel that they would be willing to do. All right, last slide here is just basically some reference. So on the screen here, you can see there are some different resources that you have. One of those is the International Student Services has a intercultural training for faculty and staff. So that's something that if you feel you could benefit, or you could learn more about your students and possibly adapt to better understand what's going to happen in your classroom, that could be helpful. We have, aside from the International Student Services Office, we have the International Accelerator Program, which is the department that I work for. We have a lot of experience working with international students, and hopefully we've shared some good tips here today with you that's specific to that. But if you have any specific questions that you think that we might be able to help with, then please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll help as we can. And also the international program for the English program for internationals. That is the program that Anne is affiliated with. And they also have a lot of experience working with international students. So these three offices here that are all under the umbrella office of Global Carolina are here at your service to help where we can. And the final resource listed down here is the Writing Center. One thing that I should have entered but didn't is the peer tutoring that's offered through the Student Success Center. We've had good results sending our students to those resources here on campus and getting help with their individual needs.